Imagine having to hire a professional mistress, rent a seedy hotel room for 10 minutes, and pay a photographer to snap you in a fake embrace just to convince a judge you'd earned the right to be free. If you think modern divorce is messy, the 1950s took marital escape to a level of calculated theater that would shock even the most cynical screenwriter, because the law didn't care if your marriage was a living nightmare of silent treatments, abandonment, or violence. Unless you had photographic proof of an affair or a witness who could describe the act with forensic, almost pornographic precision, you were legally trapped in a system designed to preserve the institution at the expense of the individual. You see, before no-fault divorce swept the nation in the 1970s, a woman had to prove her husband was guilty of a specific matrimonial crime, and adultery was the golden ticket. But here's the absolute madness of it. A wife couldn't just point a finger and cry, betrayal. She had to bring a live witness, usually a paid private eye, who had to testify under oath about seeing the act in a way that invaded privacy to a humiliating degree. And judges were notoriously strict about the quality of that evidence, which brings me to a Delaware case from 1959 that still makes legal historians shake their heads in disbelief. In that case, a wife was denied a divorce, even though two private detectives testified they saw her husband lying flat on top of another woman in a parked car at night. Yet because the detectives couldn't confirm whether genitals actually made contact or whether the woman's pants were fully removed, the court ruled it was mere indiscretion and not the legal definition of adultery required to dissolve a marriage, forcing that poor woman to remain tied to a husband who was publicly humiliating her. This impossible standard birthed a shadow economy so absurd it sounds invented. Desperate couples, often on mutually agreed terms, would hire a professional co-respondent. And yes, that was the actual legal term, a sex worker, or even an out-of-word actress who would check into a cheap motel with the husband, where a hired photographer would burst in at the right moment to capture a staged photograph of the two in bed together, usually fully clothed because, in an uncontested case, the mere implication was enough to check the legal box. The judge almost certainly knew it was a charade, a piece of theater performed by two consenting adults who simply wanted to untie their lives. But he would look the other way and grant the decree, because this fabricated evidence was the only escape hatch in a system that had no mercy for honest unhappiness. And for the woman who survived this gauntlet, who held that precious piece of paper declaring her free, her life under a microscope of bizarre, unwritten societal rules was just about to begin, rules far stranger and more invasive than anything she'd endured in court. You'd think that surviving the courtroom circus and finally holding that precious divorce decree would mean a woman could exhale, maybe even celebrate. But in the 1950s, the very next rule kicked in with the subtlety of a guillotine. A divorced woman was expected to dress and behave exactly like a widow in mourning, as if her husband had died instead of simply signing papers. And the social enforcement of this unwritten code was so vicious that wearing a bright red dress to the grocery store could get you labeled a loose woman by lunchtime. I need you to picture this, because it's one of those details that makes you realize how performative every aspect of a woman's life was back then. Etiquette books and women's magazines of the era, same ones that taught you how to set a perfect dinner table, actually published guidelines on what a divorcee could and couldn't wear. And the universal rule was dark, muted colors, no flashy jewelry, nothing that could be interpreted as celebrating her new status, because the logic, twisted as it sounds, was that she should publicly demonstrate shame and grief over the death of her marriage, even if that marriage had been a living hell she was desperate to escape. A woman who dared to wear a floral print dress or, heaven forbid, a hint of lipstick too bright, was sending what society called an invitation. A silent signal that she was emotionally recovered and therefore sexually available, which, in the vocabulary of the 1950s, meant she was one step away from moral collapse. And here's the chilling practical consequence. Other women policed this harder than anyone. I'm talking about the neighbor who would note that Mrs. Eyre Ray, that Mrs. Patterson on Maple Street wore pearl earrings to the PTA meeting only 6 months after her divorce was finalized, whisper about it in hushed, scandalized tones over Bridge Club, and, within a week, Mrs. the Prized. Patterson would find herself excluded from the carpool rotation, uninvited from the church bake sale committee, and treated as if she carried some contagious moral disease that might infect the happily married wives. There's a heartbreaking documentary interview from a woman who lived through this. She recalled being taken aside by her own sister, who told her to pack away anything yellow, pink, or patterned, because you're a divorcee now, dear. You have to dress like you've lost something precious, even if what you lost was a drunk who broke your arm twice. And this public performance of perpetual sorrow wasn't just about clothes. It dictated her posture, her tone of voice, the very way she walked down the street. Because a divorced woman who laughed too loudly at a joke or appeared too relaxed in a social setting was violating the unspoken contract that she should remain visibly diminished by her failure, a walking cautionary tale rather than a free human being. The psychological weight of this must have been crushing. Imagine finally escaping a miserable, perhaps abusive marriage, tasting freedom for the first time, only to be told by everyone around you, from your family to your colleagues to the checkout girl of the drugstore, that your only acceptable public emotion was a quiet, dignified sadness, and that any sign of joy was proof you were morally bankrupt. That is the bizarre, suffocating rule of the divorce mourning period. And if a woman thought the judgment of her wardrobe was invasive, she hadn't yet faced the even stranger, more intimate surveillance that governed the next phase of her new life. If the mourning wardrobe was suffocating, the next rule was straight-up solitary confinement. A divorced woman in the 1950s was expected to observe an unspoken but ruthlessly enforced 6-month quarantine, during which she could not be seen alone with any man or to date, not a colleague, not even her own brother-in-law, dropping off a casserole, because if a single neighbor spotted a male silhouette through her living room curtains after dark, her reputation would be shredded so fast she'd lose her job, her housing, and possibly custody of her children before she could even explain who the man actually was. Let that sink in for a moment, because it's not an exaggeration born of old movies. This was the lived reality, dictated by a society that viewed a divorcee not as a single woman restarting her life, but as a ticking time bomb of sexual availability, someone whose very existence in a neighborhood posed an existential threat to every marriage around her. The logic was as perverse as it was pervasive. A woman who had once been sexually active within marriage now possessed awakened desires. And without a husband to contain them, she was supposedly incapable of platonic interaction with any male over the age of 12. So the 6-month cooling-off period served as a kind of probation, a test to prove she wasn't what the gossips already assumed she was. Here's the detail that makes your stomach turn. This wasn't just neighborhood busybody stuff. It was baked into the professional world too. So a nurse or a secretary who'd just finalized her divorce would receive a quiet, unofficial warning from her female supervisor often. A married woman herself, that being seen having coffee with a man, even a professional acquaintance discussing a work project, would be grounds for termination because it reflected poorly on the moral standards of the institution. I came across a first-hand account from a woman who worked as a medical receptionist in Ohio in 1954. She recounted how her own brother, who was in town for one night and needed to drop off legal papers related to their deceased mother's estate, insisted on meeting her at a diner because he'd heard from a friend that entering a divorcee's apartment after sunset would compromise her. And she said she sat there in that fluorescent-lit diner with her own flesh and blood, crying into her coffee because she realized her home was now a crime scene where any male presence was evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. The cruelty of this rule extended into the most innocent corners of life. A divorcee couldn't accept a ride home from a male co-worker when it was raining, couldn't invite her daughter's male piano teacher inside without leaving the front door wide open, couldn't even host a mixed-gender dinner party without a married couple present as chaperones, because every interaction was filtered through the assumption that she was desperate, predatory, or both. And the truly insidious part? The men knew it too, which meant divorced women became targets for the exact behavior they were being accused of. Courting married men who assumed a divorcee must be an easy conquest would knock on her door at odd hours, proposition her at church functions, or spread rumors about an imaginary affair the moment she rejected their advances, knowing full well that if the accusation got back to the community, it was her word that would disintegrate, not his. So for 6 long months, a woman who'd already survived the humiliation of a courtroom had to essentially disappear from any mixed-gender social interaction, living like a cloistered nun, not because she chose to, but because the alternative was being branded a harlot in a town that never forgot a label. And if you think that level of surveillance was unbearable, just wait until you hear how the law itself stepped in to strip her of something even more fundamental when children were involved. Just when you think the social torture can't get any more absurd, the law itself steps in with a rule so maddening it'll make you want to throw something across the room. A divorced woman in the 1950s, even one with a steady paycheck and a spotless reputation, was legally considered incapable of signing her own lease, opening a bank account, or obtaining a credit card without a male co-signer, meaning she had to crawl back to her father, a brother, or even the ex-husband who might have put her in the hospital just to get a roof over her head. Yeah, you heard that correctly, and I need you to absorb the full insanity of this, because it flips everything we assume about the dignity of that era on its head. A woman who had gathered the courage, the evidence, and the sheer willpower to drag herself through the humiliating fault-based divorce gauntlet we talked about earlier, who had stood before a judge and been legally declared free from a man, would walk out of that courthouse only to discover that her freedom was a legal fiction because banks, landlords, and credit agencies still viewed her as a dependent entity, a half-citizen whose signature carried about as much weight as a grocery list. Let me paint you the picture that 1,000 women lived through. Imagine you finally escaped a husband who controlled every dime, maybe one who drank half his paycheck before he got home and left you counting pennies to feed the kids, and now you've landed a decent job as a secretary or a department store clerk. You found a modest apartment within your budget, and you show up with your first month's rent and a handshake ready, only to have the landlord slide a form across the desk and say, "I'll need your father's or your ex-husband's signature on the bottom line, ma'am, just standard procedure." Your own money wasn't enough, your own steady employment history wasn't enough, your own moral character vouched for by a pastor wasn't enough. A man had to sign because the legal and financial infrastructure of the entire country was built. The credit situation was even more degrading. If a divorcee walked into a department store and applied for a charge account to buy a winter coat, the credit manager would literally call her ex-husband or her father to ask permission. And if either man said no, or if she couldn't produce one because her father was deceased and her ex-husband had vanished to another state, she was simply denied, forced to live on cash alone in an economy that was increasingly built on installment payments, which meant she couldn't buy a refrigerator, couldn't finance a used car, couldn't do 100 things that married women could do as long as their husbands' names were on the dotted line. And here's the cruelest twist I've come across in my research. There are documented cases from the mid-1950s where divorced women, having no living male relative and no contact with a deadbeat ex, resorted to asking their teenage sons to co-sign documents, a 16-year-old boy with a paper route signing a lease for his own mother, because his scrawl carried more legal weight in the eyes of a bank than her adult signature. And if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the suffocating architecture of that era, I don't know what will. The financial cage kept her dependent by design. A constant reminder that society viewed her divorce not as liberation, but as a suspicious anomaly that needed to be contained. And this total erosion of her financial autonomy was only matched by the next horror waiting around the corner, where the very children she was trying to raise could be ripped away from her based on nothing more than a neighbor's gossip. If the financial cage made your blood boil, brace yourself for the part of this story that would terrify any parent into sleepless nights. A divorced mother in the 1950s could lose custody of her children permanently, not because she was negligent or abusive or unfit in any way that would hold up in a modern courtroom, but simply because a neighbor reported seeing a man's hat on her coat rack or a pair of unfamiliar shoes on her front porch after sunset. I need you to read that again and let it land, because this isn't a hypothetical scare tactic whispered among anxious women back then. This was a legal reality baked into custody rulings all across America, where judges routinely inserted morality clauses into divorce, decrees that gave the court ongoing jurisdiction over a mother's private life, essentially placing her under permanent surveillance with her children as the hostage. Here's how this nightmare operated on the ground. A woman would be awarded custody, often after the grueling ordeal of proving her husband's fault. And tucked into the fine print of her divorce judgment would be a clause stating that she must conduct herself in a manner befitting a moral and chaste custodial parent, which sounded vague and reasonable on paper, but in practice meant that any neighbor, any disgruntled relative, any self-appointed guardian of community virtue could file a complaint with the court alleging immoral conduct, and that complaint alone would trigger a custody review hearing. The immoral conduct in question? It could be as pathetically trivial as a male colleague from work stopping by to pick up a report he'd left in her car, a repairman staying 15 minutes longer than the job required, or a date just one single innocent date, where the man walked her to the door and stood on the porch for a 2-minute goodbye, because the presumption baked into the legal system was that a divorced mother's sexuality was a permanent liability, a dormant volcano that could erupt at any moment and destroy her children's moral development. I interviewed a woman who was a child in exactly this situation in 1957. She told me her mother lost custody of her and her two siblings after the neighbor across the street, a woman who had never spoken a single unkind word to their faces, submitted a sworn affidavit to the family court stating that a gentleman caller of unknown character was observed entering the residence at 9:15 p.m. and did not depart until 10:40 p.m. And that gentleman caller, she learned decades later while digging through old court records, was her uncle, her mother's own brother, who had driven 3 hours to console his sister on the anniversary of their father's death. And the mother lost her children anyway because the judge ruled that entertaining any unrelated mainland. Yes, the court didn't bother to verify the relationship during. The institutional cruelty of this system was magnified by its asymmetry. Divorced fathers were rarely, if ever, subjected to morality clauses, and a widower could remarry the next day and bring a stepmother into his children's lives with barely a raised eyebrow. But a divorced mother was expected to live like a nun until her children turned 18. Her entire social and romantic existence frozen in amber because the state had decided her maternal fitness was conditional on her invisibility as a woman. What makes this even more gut-wrenching is the way it forced mothers into a state of perpetual paranoia, not just about their own behavior, but about their children's. Because a bitter ex-husband could weaponize the morality clause by coaching a child to mention mommy's friend who came over for dinner during a weekend visitation, and that one sentence from a 5-year-old's innocent mouth could trigger a legal avalanche that buried the mother in attorney fees she couldn't afford, and custody hearings that dragged on for months. So a divorced woman didn't just mourn her marriage in dark dresses and avoid eye contact with men for 6 months. She raised her children under the constant threat that any whisper, any shadow on the window shade, any toy left behind by a visitor's child could be stitched together into evidence of her unfitness. And if you think that level of psychological torture represents the bottom of this rabbit hole, wait until you see what employers felt entitled to do to her the moment her divorce became public knowledge. You'd hope that after everything, the staged adultery, the mourning wardrobe, the 6-month quarantine, the male co-signer humiliation, the terror of losing her kids, a divorced woman could at least count on the dignity of earning a living. But the 1950s workplace had a special dagger waiting just for her. Companies across America routinely fired women the moment their divorce became public knowledge, not because their job performance had slipped or they'd violated any written policy, but because their newly single status was deemed a bad moral influence on the other secretaries and could supposedly corrupt the entire office atmosphere just by existing. Let that sink in, because it's one of those realities that sounds too cruel to be true, yet court records and personal testimonies from the era confirm it over and over. A woman who had spent years building a career as a secretary, a telephone operator, a nurse, or a department store clerk would walk into work on a Monday morning, having finalized her divorce the previous Friday, and by lunchtime she'd be called into the personnel manager's office and told, with a straight face and a tone of paternal concern, that her continued employment was no longer appropriate given the circumstances of her personal life. The reasoning, if you can call it that, was a toxic cocktail of puritanical moralizing and naked economic calculation. A divorced woman was perceived as sexually experienced and therefore sexually threatening. A temptress who might seduce the married male executives or, perhaps worse, plant dangerous ideas about independence in the heads of the married female employees who might start wondering why they were tolerating their own miserable husbands when escape was technically possible. I found a case from a manufacturing company in Michigan in 1953 where a woman who'd worked as a bookkeeper for 11 years with unblemished performance reviews and multiple raises was terminated 2 weeks after her divorce appeared in the local newspaper's public records. Sectionees, newspapers used to print divorce decrees like sports scores, a practice we'll come back to. And the official termination letter stated that the position of bookkeeper requires a person of unimpeachable moral standing who can serve as a role model to junior female staff, as if operating an adding machine required sainthood, and her divorce had retroactively erased her 11 years of competence. The gut punch didn't stop at termination either. Even if she found a new job, which was an uphill battle because employers openly asked about marital status on applications and treated divorced as a red flag, only slightly less alarming than recently released from prison, she would almost certainly earn significantly less than a married woman doing the exact same work, because the prevailing logic, and I'm using the word logic generously here, was that a married woman's income was merely supplemental to her husband's. But a divorced woman was desperate and would accept anything, so why pay her a fair wage? This created an economic death spiral that trapped countless women, fired from the good job, hired at a worse one for less money, unable to get credit or release without a male co-signer as we discussed, and now with children to feed on a salary that was deliberately depressed below a living wage because the labor market had collectively decided her misfortune was a bargaining chip. And the cherry on this rotten sundae? Many of these same companies had pension policies that automatically forfeited a woman's retirement contributions upon divorce, because the plan assumed she'd be taken care of by a husband. And if that husband was gone through divorce rather than death, well, that was her problem, not the company's. A neat little financial trap that left divorced women not just impoverished in the present, but robbed of their future security, all while the society that had built this labyrinth of obstacles clucked its tongue and wondered why some divorced women ended up in desperate situations they'd never imagined for themselves. If you've been following this descent into the bizarre underworld of 1950s divorce rules and thinking surely we've hit the bottom, let me introduce you to the most Orwellian detail yet. In small towns, and even in respectable suburban neighborhoods, informal morality committees, composed of married women, actually kept written logs of divorced women's comings and goings, noting who visited their homes, at what hour, and for how long, then sharing these surveillance reports with landlords, employers, and even family court judges to ensure that no divorcee ever forgot she was a permanently suspect person living in a glass house where every curtain twitch was documented. This wasn't some fringe vigilante nonsense confined to one weirdo church group in a backwater village. The practice was widespread enough that women's magazines of the era, the very same publications that taught you how to make a perfect Jell-O mold, occasionally published coy articles with titles like, "Is your neighborhood safe from improper influences?" which was coded language for, "Here's how to keep an eye on that divorcee 3 doors down." The mechanics of this surveillance were chillingly systematic. A woman who'd recently divorced would notice almost immediately that the normal friendly rhythms of neighborhood life had shifted around her, that conversations on the sidewalk stopped when she approached, that her garbage cans seemed to be inspected more closely on collection day looking for liquor bottles was a favorite pastime, and that the mailman or the milkman seemed to linger a beat longer at her door, not out of friendliness, but because they'd been recruited as unofficial informants by the local gossip network. One memoir I read from a woman who divorced in 1955 in a suburb of Chicago described discovering that the lady next door, who'd always been cordial and even warm during the marriage, had been keeping a small notebook on her kitchen windowsill, specifically positioned to have a clear view of the divorcee's front entrance, and in that notebook she recorded the license plate numbers of every car that parked in the driveway, the duration of every visit, and whether the visitor was male or female, single or accompanied, all of which she then casually dropped into conversation at the weekly bridge club, where the other wives would compare notes like intelligence analysts, piecing together a threat assessment. The devastating power of this surveillance network lay in its informality. Because nothing was official, there was no way to confront it, no libel suit to file against whispered accusations, no HR department to appeal to when the rumors about frequent male visitors cost you your job or your housing or, as we discussed, your children. Because the accusation didn't need to be proven in court to do its damage, it just needed to circulate long enough to become accepted truth in the collective mind of the community. The psychological toll of living under this microscope warped behavior in ways that are hard to fully imagine from our modern vantage point. Divorced women developed obsessive routines of self-policing, only doing laundry at odd hours to avoid being seen hanging unmentionables on the line in case a neighbor thought the lace trim looked too provocative, keeping their curtains permanently drawn even on sunny days, timing their grocery runs to the least busy hours to minimize the number of eyes on them, and some even stopped accepting visits from their own fathers and brothers because the very sight of a male figure at the door was enough to reignite the whisper mill, a level of isolation that feels less like a social code and more like a prison sentence served in your own living room. After everything we've uncovered, the fake adultery productions, the mandatory mourning attire, the 6-month social quarantine, the financial strangulation, the custody blackmail, the workplace purges, the neighborhood spy networks. You might assume a divorced woman's only option was to grit her teeth and endure. But there was one final devastating rule that pushed thousands of women into a course of action so extreme it sounds like something out of a witness protection program. A significant number of divorced women in the 1950s simply erased their own identities. Packing a single suitcase, moving to a city where nobody knew their name, and introducing themselves by a new first name, sometimes even fabricating an entirely fictional backstory involving a dead husband rather than an ex-husband, because becoming a widow was infinitely safer and more respectable than admitting the truth. Let me tell you about this phenomenon, because it's the detail that, more than any other, reveals the true inhumanity of the system we've been dissecting. Newspapers of the era routinely published divorce decrees in the public records section alongside bankruptcy filings and criminal convictions, listing the names and addresses of both parties for anyone to read over their morning coffee, which meant a woman's most private failure was broadcast to every current and future employer, every prospective landlord, every nosy neighbor in every town she might try to move to, creating a paper trail of shame that followed her like a criminal record. This practice of publishing divorce notices wasn't a quirk of a few small-town papers. Major metropolitan dailies did it too, and the result was that a divorced woman couldn't simply relocate and start fresh, because the first thing any curious person did when a new single woman arrived in town was check the public records and back issues of the local paper. And if they found her name attached to a divorce filing, the entire cycle of surveillance and suspicion we've been describing would boot up all over again, fresh and ready to destroy her anew. So women did the only thing they could do. They disappeared. I found a collection of oral histories from a researcher who tracked down elderly women in the 1990s who had divorced in the 1950s. And one of them described taking a Greyhound bus from Oklahoma to California the morning after her divorce was finalized, with $43 in her purse and a cheap wedding band she'd bought at a pawn shop worn on her left hand. And when she applied for a job as a waitress in a San Diego diner, she told the manager her name was Margaret, not her real name, and that her husband had died heroically in Korea. A lie she maintained for the next 40 years because the truth would have gotten her fired the first week. Another woman recounted moving from a small town in Indiana to Chicago, where the blessed anonymity of a big city offered some protection. But she still told her landlady and her co-workers that she was a widow because the word divorced on a rental application or a job form was essentially a black mark that would send it straight to the rejection pile. And the irony she reflected on decades later with a bitter laugh in the recorded interview was that she had escaped a man who lied to her constantly, only to build a new life on a lie she had to maintain every single day, all because society had decided the truth was more shameful than a fabrication. This quiet exodus of women fleeing not just their ex-husbands but their own names created a hidden demographic that historians are only beginning to uncover. Thousands of widows with no dead husbands. Thousands of women living under borrowed or modified identities, cut off from their families of origin, not because they wanted to be, but because any contact risked exposing the truth to a world that punished honesty with economic ruin and social death. And this, in the end, was the strangest and most brutal rule of all. The rule that said a divorced woman had no right to her own story, that her only path to peace was to become someone else entirely, a ghost walking through a life that wasn't quite hers. Now I need to take you somewhere truly dark, because everything we've discussed so far, the staged adultery, the mourning dresses, the 6-month quarantine, the financial erasure, the custody blackmail, the workplace termination, the neighborhood spy networks, and the forced identity erasure, all of it pales in comparison to the most horrifying rule of all, one that's been buried so deep in medical history that most people have never heard it whispered. In the 1950s, a woman whose husband didn't want to grant her a divorce, or a woman who fought too hard for her freedom, could be declared insane by her husband with the backing of a single compliant psychiatrist, and she could be subjected to a transorbital lobotomy, an ice pick through the eye socket procedure designed to permanently strip her of her will, her personality, and her ability to resist. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment, because I'm not reaching for hyperbole. Here this happened to thousands of women, and the statistics tell a story that will turn your stomach. By 1952, an estimated 50,000 lobotomies had been performed in the United States and Canada. And according to a 2018 study, 75% of lobotomy patients as of 1942 were women. And these weren't women suffering from psychosis or schizophrenia. They were women whose husbands, fathers, or male guardians deemed them too opinionated, too independent, too sexually active, or simply too difficult to control. The architect of this horror was a man named Dr. Walter Freeman, who toured the United States in a van he called the lobotomobile, performing the procedure in motel parking lots and small-town hospitals with no surgical training beyond a medical degree, using an ice pick-like instrument that he would insert through the eye socket above the eyeball and into the frontal lobe with a hammer tap, severing the connections that made a person who they were. What does this have to do with divorced women? Everything. Because a husband facing a divorce petition from a wife he wanted to keep under his thumb could simply have her declared mentally unfit, shipped off to an institution, and lobotomized before she could ever see the inside of a courtroom, and this wasn't some rare freak occurrence. It was a recognized, medically sanctioned method of silencing women who stepped out of line. The link between divorce threats and lobotomies is documented in harrowing case files and memoirs the survivors' children have painstakingly assembled. A woman named Gretchen, for instance, was a vivacious, competent young professional in Chicago's hospitality industry who married, had a child, and then made the fatal mistake of asserting herself in her marriage, and in 1950, Dr. Soughton Freeman pronounced her a paranoid schizophrenic on a Friday and performed the lobotomy the following Monday, robbing her of all the drive and sparkle that had defined her existence. Her daughter Roberta later wrote a memoir reconstructing her mother's life, and discovered that the schizophrenia diagnosis was essentially code for she argued with her husband and wanted more autonomy, a pattern that repeated itself in case after case where women who sought separation or divorce were pathologized for the crime of wanting freedom. The procedure itself was barbaric beyond description. Freeman would insert the orbitoclast, this ice pick instrument, through the tear duct, tapping it with a small hammer to break through the thin bone of the eye socket, then wiggle it around inside the frontal lobe to sever the neural connections, and the patient, who was usually awake and only sometimes given electroconvulsive shock to render her unconscious for a few minutes, would emerge from the procedure, docile, compliant, and permanently altered. A living ghost who no longer possessed the capacity to defy her husband or demand a divorce because the part of her brain that housed her will, her desires, and her capacity for resistance had been physically destroyed. The medical establishment of the time didn't just tolerate this. It celebrated it, with Freeman boasting about his speed and efficiency, once performing 25 lobotomies in a single day, and the psychiatric community nominating him for a Nobel Prize. All while the women he mutilated were being returned to their husbands as obedient shells who would never again mention the word divorce. And here's the chilling connection to our broader story. If you were a woman in the 1950s whose husband didn't agree to the divorce, or who tried to leave without the elaborate choreography of staged adultery we described in the opening section, your husband didn't just have the power to fight you in court, he had the power to have a doctor declare you insane and literally erase your personality with a metal spike through your eye, and the law, the medical profession, and society would all nod along as if this was a reasonable solution to a disobedient wife. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't a horror movie. This was the reality lurking behind every divorce fight in the 1950s. And the number of women who went into a courtroom demanding their freedom and came out of a psychiatric ward unable to remember their own children's names will never be fully known. Because the records were buried, the families were ashamed, and the doctors who profited from the lobotomy craze never faced a single day of accountability. If the lobotomy revelation felt like we'd reached the absolute floor of human cruelty, let me pull you deeper into a related nightmare that targeted divorced women with surgical precision. In the 1950s, a divorced woman could be dragged before a judge and declared an incorrigible or wayward woman under what were known as wayward minor or vagrancy statutes, laws originally designed for prostitutes and runaways, but repurposed with devastating creativity to punish divorcees whose only crime was being seen in public with a man, wearing the wrong clothes, or simply existing while single in a world that interpreted female solitude as a form of criminal deviance. These laws, which existed on the books in dozens of states including New York, California, and Massachusetts, allowed police officers to arrest a woman on mere suspicion of lewd conduct or idleness, without a warrant, without evidence of any actual crime, and without her having committed any act that would remotely qualify as illegal under any rational legal code. And the punishment wasn't just a fine or a night in jail. It was a sentence of up to 3 years in a state reformatory or a house of correction, where she'd be forced into hard labor, strip-searched, deloused, and subjected to a regime of psychological conditioning designed to break her spirit and remake her into a docile, submissive woman who understood that her divorce had placed her one misstep away from being treated like a common criminal. The most notorious of these laws was New York's wayward minor statute, which technically applied to women under 21, but was frequently stretched to cover divorced women of any age under the legal fiction that an unmarried woman without a male guardian was essentially a minor in the eyes of the law. a permanently dependent creature who required state supervision if she didn't have a husband to supervise her. Here's a case that will make you grit your teeth. In 1956, a 28-year-old divorced mother in Buffalo was arrested under this statute after a neighbor reported seeing her kissing a man goodnight on her own front porch. And the judge, rather than dismissing the charge as the absurd harassment it was, sentenced her to 6 months at the New York State Training School for Girls, where she was strip-searched by male guards, forced to wear a prison uniform, and assigned to laundry duty alongside actual juvenile delinquents, all because she'd had the audacity to receive a kiss on her own property while being a divorced woman. The internal logic of these laws, and I use the word logic charitably, was that a divorced woman, having demonstrated her capacity for sexual activity within her now dissolved marriage, was in a state of permanent moral jeopardy, a walking temptation who needed to be controlled by either a husband or the state, and if the husband was gone, the state would step into his shoes with all the coercive power of the criminal justice system. What makes this even more insidious is the way it interacted with the neighborhood surveillance networks we discussed earlier. A neighbor's complaint wasn't just fodder for gossip anymore. It was actionable intelligence that could result in a police officer knocking on a divorced woman's door at midnight, handcuffing her in front of her terrified children, and hauling her to a cell where she'd be held until the male relative could post bail and vouch for her character. A ritual of humiliation designed to remind her that freedom was a conditional gift she could lose at any moment. And the reformatories themselves? They were essentially prisons for women who hadn't committed crimes, where rehabilitation consisted of mandatory religious instruction, domestic skills training, and lectures on the virtues of wifely submission, all delivered by matrons who had internalized the patriarchal logic so completely they saw themselves not as jailers but as saviors of fallen women who needed to be broken down before they could be rebuilt as acceptable members of society. A divorced woman in one of these institutions could expect to spend her days scrubbing floors on her knees, attending compulsory chapel services 3 times a day, and undergoing invasive medical examinations justified as health checks, but functionally designed to humiliate and dehumanize, all for the crime of signing a piece of paper that said her marriage was over. This was the state's backup plan for the women who survived the lobotomy era with their brains intact. If you couldn't be surgically pacified, you could be legally incarcerated, and the distinction between a divorce decree and an arrest warrant was paper thin for women who failed to navigate the impossible rules we've been cataloging. We've talked about how society, the medical establishment, the legal system, and the criminal justice apparatus all conspired to make a divorced woman's life unlivable. But there's one more institution we haven't fully explored, and it might be the cruelest of all, because it was supposed to be the place where broken people found refuge: church. The religious rule for divorced women in the 1950s was stark and unforgiving. They were not merely discouraged from remarrying, they were told in explicit, unambiguous terms from pulpits across every major denomination that they were living in a state of permanent, ongoing adultery, that their very existence was a sin against God, and that they would burn in hell for eternity unless they either reconciled with their ex-husband or committed to a life of total celibacy without complaint. A sentence of spiritual death delivered weekly from the mouths of pastors, priests, and elders who had no qualms about singling out divorced women by name in front of entire congregations. The theological machinery behind this was rooted in a very specific interpretation of Matthew 19:9, where Jesus says that whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And the 1950s church took this verse and weaponized it against women with a ferocity they never applied to men, because a divorced man who remarried was seen as a poor fellow who'd had a rough break and found a good woman to take care of him, while a divorced woman who remarried was a brazen harlot who had rejected God's plan and dragged some innocent new husband down with her into eternal damnation. Let me give you a concrete example that illustrates how this played out in real lives. A woman named Barbara, who divorced her physically abusive husband in 1953 after he broke her jaw and 2 of her ribs, was called before the board of deacons at her Baptist church in Tennessee and told that while they understood her suffering, she would be removed from all teaching positions, forbidden from singing in the choir, and denied communion until she demonstrated a spirit of repentance and a willingness to seek reconciliation with the man who had put her in the hospital, because her divorce, regardless of the circumstances, had made her a public sinner whose presence among the congregation was a scandal. Barbara never returned to that church. And in her memoir, she wrote about how the spiritual abandonment hurt more than the broken bones, because the bruises healed in weeks. But the message that God had sided with her abuser stayed with her for the rest of her life. This wasn't a fringe fundamentalist thing either. Mainstream Protestant denominations, including Methodists, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians, all had formal or informal bans on divorced members holding any position of leadership, and Catholic women faced the additional barrier of annulment tribunals that could take years and cost thousands of dollars in the modern equivalent, with no guarantee of success, and a process so invasive that women were required to provide detailed accounts of their sexual histories, their courtship, and the intimate failures of their marriages to panels of elderly male priests who would then decide whether the marriage had ever truly existed in the eyes of God. The practical consequences of this religious ostracism rippled through every aspect of a divorced woman's life. If she had children, they might be barred from the church school or excluded from youth groups because their mother's sin had tainted the family. If she relied on church networks for employment leads or housing referrals, or simply the social fabric that held communities together in an era before the internet and widespread mobility, she was cut off from all of it, cast into a social desert where the only people who would associate with her were other outcasts whose association only deepened her stigma. And the cruelest twist of all was the way churches dangled the possibility of redemption while making it functionally impossible to achieve. She could be forgiven, she was told, if she truly repented. But true repentance meant acknowledging that her divorce had been a sin, which meant redefining her escape from abuse or abandonment or betrayal as a moral failing on her part, a catch-22 that forced her to either live as a spiritual pariah or gaslight herself into believing that her suffering had been her own fault. Some women, unable to bear the isolation, simply stopped attending church altogether, which in the 1950s was a radical act that came with its own social costs, marking them as not just divorced, but godless. A label that invited even more suspicion and surveillance from the morality committees we discussed earlier. Others found their way to a handful of progressive congregations in large cities, where pastors were quietly beginning to question the traditional teachings. But these were rare islands of grace in an ocean of judgment. And the vast majority of divorced women in the 1950s faced a choice between a church that condemned them and a lonely silence that no amount of personal resilience could fully fill. After absorbing the spiritual brutality of the church's treatment of divorced women, you might wonder if there was any corner of life where they could find peace, any space untouched by the surveillance, the judgment, the economic strangulation, and the legal persecution we documented. And the answer brings us to one of the strangest and most revealing rules of all. Divorced women in the 1950s were essentially banned from living in certain neighborhoods, entire planned communities and suburban developments explicitly writing no divorcees into their homeowner association covenants, their rental agreements, and their unspoken but ironclad social contracts, forcing divorced women to cluster in dilapidated rooming houses, cheap motels on the wrong side of town, or the infamous divorcee row apartment buildings that sprang up in larger cities as de facto ghettos for the maritally dispossessed. This residential segregation wasn't a covert prejudice whispered behind closed doors. It was proudly advertised as a selling point with real estate brochures for new suburban developments using phrases like "a community of intact families" and "neighbors who share your values" as code for no divorced women allowed here. And rental agents were trained to spot the signs of a divorcee: absence of a wedding ring, the lack of a husband's name on the application, the awkward pause when asked about marital status, and to reject her application with a polite smile and a vague reference to a waiting list that somehow never shortened no matter how many months passed. The result was a housing crisis that nobody talked about, but that every divorced woman understood viscerally. She could rarely afford to buy a home because, as we discussed in the financial section, she couldn't get a mortgage without a male co-signer, and she couldn't rent a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood because landlords saw her as a moral liability and a financial risk. A woman who might attract unsavory male visitors, or fall behind on rent, or corrupt the married women in the building with her scandalous independence. So where did she go? Into the shadow housing market that existed in every American city. The converted attics with no running water, the basement apartments with one tiny window at ground level, the motels that offered weekly rates and asked no questions, the rooming houses run by widows who'd seen enough of life to know that a woman's story was rarely as simple as the gossips claimed. In New York, The Upper East Side became home to a concentration of divorced women who filled the studio apartments of aging brownstones, forming an underground community of women who supported each other in ways that their former neighbors and churches never would, sharing childcare, swapping job leads, and developing a silent code of solidarity that allowed them to survive in a city that had no official place for them. In Los Angeles, a complex called the El Royale Apartments on Rossmore Avenue became known as a haven for divorcees. So much so that the building manager stopped even asking about marital status and simply assumed every single woman who applied had a divorce story she'd rather not tell. But these exceptions only proved the rule. For every woman who found a safe landing spot, dozens more cycled through dangerous housing situations, living in quarters that were technically illegal, paying cash to landlords who exploited their desperation, moving every few months when the gossip caught up with them, or the money ran out, or a neighbor's complaint triggered an eviction that no lawyer would help them fight, because, as we've seen throughout this story, the law was not on their side. And the isolation of these living situations compounded every other struggle we've talked about. Living in a rundown apartment on the edge of town made it harder to find and keep a job, harder to convince a judge that you were a fit mother with a stable home environment for your children, harder to resist the depression and despair that the entire system was designed to produce, and harder to imagine that life could ever be anything other than a grinding, lonely battle for survival. This, in the end, was the final rule of the divorced woman's existence in the 1950s. She was not allowed to belong anywhere, not in the family home she'd lost, not in the church that had cast her out, not in the workplace that had fired her, not in the neighborhoods that had barred their doors against her, and not even in the public record of her own life, which the newspapers had published and the gossips had archived and the judges had filed away as evidence of her permanent, irredeemable failure. We've discussed the church's spiritual abandonment, but there's a related layer of religious cruelty that deserves its own spotlight because it turned the supposedly sacred institution of faith into a financial weapon. A divorced woman in the 1950s could be, and frequently was, denied burial in church cemeteries, refused funeral services for her own parents by the parish priest, and in some documented cases, literally barred from attending her own child's wedding ceremony if she attempted to enter the church building while still legally divorced, a punishment that transformed her marital status into a permanent excommunication that haunted her even at the most sacred milestones of family life. Imagine, for a moment, the psychological violence of this. Your daughter is getting married. You've raised her through the divorce, through the poverty, through the gossip, through the years of being treated as a moral leper. And on the day she walks down the aisle, you are told by an usher, sometimes a church elder, sometimes a relative who has been pressured by the congregation, that your presence in the sanctuary would defile the ceremony, because you represent a broken covenant. So you must either sit in the back row near the door like a shameful secret, or, in the cruelest cases, wait outside in the parking lot while your child exchanges vows you cannot hear. I came across a letter written by a woman in Georgia in 1958 who described exactly this scenario. Her only daughter was getting married in the Methodist church, where she herself had been baptized, confirmed, and married 3 decades earlier. But the new pastor, who had arrived after her divorce, informed her through a deacon that her attendance would be disruptive to the spiritual tone of the occasion, and suggested she wait at home and receive the couple afterward, a suggestion she followed because she feared that fighting it would ruin her daughter's day, and she spent the hours of the wedding alone in her empty house, staring at the wall while her daughter began her married life without her mother in the room. The cemetery situation was even more final and grotesque. Family plots purchased generations earlier, with spaces reserved for daughters and granddaughters, were suddenly declared unavailable to divorced women because their presence in consecrated ground would contaminate the family line. And in some cases, the church board would formally vote to revoke burial rights, leaving a divorced woman to face her own mortality with the knowledge that she would be interred in a potter's field or a municipal cemetery far from the family whose name she still carried. One memoir recalls a woman in Ohio who had divorced an abusive alcoholic and was told by her own brother, an elder in the Lutheran church, that she could no longer be buried in the family plot because the ground is for those who kept their vows. A sentence so breathtakingly cruel that she reportedly walked out of his house and never spoke to him again, living another 40 years and making her own burial arrangements in a secular cemetery with a headstone that read simply, "Free at last." Words that only made sense to those who knew what she had endured. This weaponization of sacred spaces, weddings, funerals, burial grounds was the church's final word on the divorced woman. She was not merely a sinner to be tolerated from a distance. She was a contagion to be kept away from the holy, a permanent exile from the rituals that give human life its meaning and its comfort. And if she wanted to participate in the spiritual life of her community, she would have to do so as a ghost, present but invisible, connected but severed, a member of the family who was no longer family in the eyes of God. Let me pull you into a rule so bizarre and specific that it reads like something out of a dystopian novel, but was, in fact, standard practice in certain states well into the late 1950s. A divorced woman who wanted to keep her children was legally required to submit to unannounced home inspections by social workers or court-appointed guardian strangers with clipboards who could enter her home at any time, open her refrigerator to check if there was enough food, sniff her breath for alcohol, count the number of beds in the house to determine if any unauthorized persons might be sleeping over, and interview her neighbors about her moral character, all while she stood there powerless to refuse, because the inspection was a condition of her custody order, and a single negative report could trigger the removal of her children within 48 hours. This wasn't Child Protective Services investigating allegations of abuse or neglect in the way we understand today. This was a parallel system designed exclusively for divorced mothers, a kind of permanent probation that assumed her guilt from the start and tasked these inspectors with finding the evidence to prove it. The inspectors, often middle-aged women employed by the family court or contracted from religious charities, were trained to look for specific signs of moral decay. A copy of a novel with a risque cover on the bookshelf, a pack of cigarettes on the coffee table, a photograph of a male friend displayed anywhere in the living room, a bathroom cabinet containing makeup that was too colorful for a respectable mother, or a refrigerator that didn't meet their subjective standard of adequate nutrition because a working mother on a single salary couldn't afford the same groceries as a two-parent household. One former social worker who later wrote a confessional memoir about her years in this system described conducting an inspection in 1953 where she noted in her report that the divorced mother kept a bottle of sherry in the kitchen cabinet, ostensibly for cooking, but the level of the bottle had decreased since the last visit, suggesting personal consumption. And this single observation about a cooking sherry bottle that had been used, presumably for cooking, was entered into the court record as evidence of potential intemperance and nearly cost the woman custody of her twin sons. The power dynamic in these inspections was designed to humiliate and control. The inspector never announced her visits in advance because the element of surprise was considered essential to catching the mother in her true state. So a divorced woman lived every single day with the knowledge that a knock on the door could come at any hour, that her children could be taken from her based on a stranger's subjective impression of her housekeeping, her pantry, her reading habits, or her facial expression when she opened the door. And here's the detail that truly reveals the sadistic architecture of this system. The inspector's reports were not confidential medical or social work documents. They were filed in the public court record, accessible to anyone who cared to look, including the ex-husband who could use the reports to harass his former wife, challenge her custody at any time, or simply enjoy the knowledge that she was being watched, judged, and tormented by a system that treated her as a criminal for the crime of being unmarried. The psychological toll of this unannounced inspection regime cannot be overstated. Divorced mothers became obsessive housekeepers, not out of pride, but out of terror, living in a state of constant readiness, hiding any item that could be misconstrued, coaching their children on what to say if a stranger asked them questions about mommy's friends, and never, ever fully relaxing in their own homes because the home was not a sanctuary. It was a stage where a performance of perfect, sexless, joyless motherhood had to be maintained at all times for an audience that wanted her to fail. There is a rule so petty and cruel in its psychological precision that it almost reads like satire. Except the women who lived through it will tell you it was one of the most effective weapons in the arsenal of social control. A divorced woman in the 1950s was not allowed to keep her married friends. The moment her divorce decree was finalized, the wives of her former social circle, the women she had lunched with, played bridge with, confided in about her failing marriage, cried on their shoulders during the separation where, under immense, often explicit pressure from their own husbands to cut off all contact, because a divorcee was now seen as a contaminant, a carrier of marital insurrection who might, through the sheer example of her continued existence, plant the idea in other women's heads that marriage was optional and escape was possible. This wasn't a slow drifting apart, born of awkwardness or changed circumstances. It was a swift, surgical severance executed with the cold precision of a social guillotine. The phone would stop ringing. The invitations to dinner parties, to holiday gatherings, to the Saturday afternoon bridge club, to the church potluck committee, all of it would evaporate within a matter of weeks, not because the divorced woman had done anything wrong, but because the married couples had collectively decided that her presence was a threat to the stability of every marriage in the group. The logic, articulated openly in advice columns and etiquette books of the era, was breathtaking in its candor. A divorced woman, having experienced sexual intimacy within marriage and now living without a husband, was presumed to be either desperately lonely and therefore a potential seductress of other women's husbands, or dangerously independent and therefore a role model for wives who might be experiencing their own marital difficulties. Either way, she had to go. One woman who divorced in 1954 in a suburb of Philadelphia described the experience with a phrase that has haunted me since I first read it. She said her former friends treated her like a ghost at a party she wasn't supposed to know was happening, because the social life of her neighborhood simply continued without her. The bridge tables rearranged to exclude her seat. The carpool rotations silently adjusted so her children were no longer included. The backyard barbecues happening 2 doors down with the laughter carrying through the summer air, while she sat on her own porch, knowing she had not been invited and would never be invited again. The husbands were often the enforcers of this exile, delivering ultimatums to their wives that left no room for negotiation. "I don't want her in this house," or "she's a bad influence," or, most revealingly, "I don't want you getting any ideas." And the wives, trapped in their own marriages with their own silent desperations, complied because they had seen what happened to the woman who didn't comply. And the lesson was clear. Association with a divorcee was an act of social suicide that could destabilize your own marriage, cost you your own friendships, and mark you as sympathetic to the enemy. The result was a forced isolation that compounded every other struggle we've discussed. A divorced woman who had lost her job, her credit, her housing options, her church, and her custody security was now stripped of her emotional support network, her shoulders to cry on, her confidants, her community. All because the sight of her face at a dinner party was enough to make married men nervous and married women complicit in their own silencing. Now let's talk about a rule so deeply embedded in the legal and financial architecture of the 1950s that it operated invisibly, like carbon monoxide in a sealed room. A divorced woman could not, under any circumstances, obtain health insurance in her own name. And if she had been covered under her ex-husband's employer-provided plan, which was the only way most middle-class families accessed healthcare, in that IRAP coverage terminated the moment the divorce decree was signed, leaving her and her children medically uninsured with no path to coverage except remarriage, a perverse incentive that trapped countless women in a choice between destitution and another potentially abusive marriage just to get a doctor's visit covered. Employer-provided health insurance was still a relatively new phenomenon in the 1950s. A product of wage controls during World War II that had led companies to compete for workers by offering benefits instead of higher salaries, and the entire system was built around a single assumption. The insured was a married man with a dependent wife and children. When the marriage dissolved, the wife ceased to exist in the eyes of the insurance company, not because of any specific exclusion written into the policy, though those existed too, but because the very concept of an individually insured woman was so foreign to the administrative imagination that the forms didn't even have a box for it. A divorced woman who walked into an insurance office to inquire about a policy would be met with confusion, then suspicion, and finally a polite but firm rejection. Individual policies for women were either unavailable, prohibitively expensive, or so riddled with exclusions for anything related to female complaints that they were essentially worthless. This created a medical underclass of divorced women and their children who simply went without care. A toothache meant pulling the tooth yourself or enduring the pain. A child's fever meant hoping it broke on its own because a doctor's visit cost cash they didn't have. A suspicious lump meant ignoring it and praying, and a chronic condition like diabetes or asthma meant a slow, grinding decline that could end in death, not from the disease itself but from the inability to afford the insulin or the inhaler that would have managed it. I found a hospital record from 1954 in which a divorced mother of 3 in Illinois died of pneumonia because she had delayed seeking treatment for 2 weeks, trying to fight the infection with over-the-counter remedies and bed rest. And when her sister finally drove her to the emergency room, she was admitted with advanced sepsis and died 3 days later, leaving her children orphaned. All because she could not afford a $5 office visit and a course of antibiotics that would have saved her life. The system knew this was happening, or the doctors knew, The social workers knew. The judges who granted divorces knew that they were, in many cases, sentencing women to a slow medical abandonment. And the system responded not with compassion or policy change, but with a shrug and a murmured reminder that this was why women should think very carefully before seeking divorce, because the consequences were not just social and financial, but physical, biological, mortal. And the body of the divorced woman was a body the healthcare system had decided was not worth protecting. If you think we've exhausted the catalogue of humiliations, let me introduce you to a rule that is so strange and specific, it almost feels like folklore until you dig into the court records and realize it was standard legal doctrine in multiple states. A divorced woman could be sued by her own adult children for loss of inheritance if she remarried. And some divorce settlements actually contained clauses stipulating that a divorced mother's assets would transfer to her children from the first marriage if she dared to take a new husband. A legal trap that turned her romantic future into a financial hostage negotiation where her own children were incentivized to police her love life. This was an extension of the alimony and property settlement logic we touched on in the section about remarriage penalties. But it went much further because it enlisted the children themselves as enforcers of their mother's celibacy. A son or daughter who saw their expected inheritance threatened by a stepfather could march into court and argue that their mother's remarriage constituted a breach of her implicit duty to preserve the family's assets for the bloodline, and courts in many jurisdictions were sympathetic to this argument, viewing a divorced mother's assets not as her own property, but as a temporary custodianship she held in trust for her children until they came of age. Links: the Saslow Verve. Saslow case we examined from Ohio in 1957 illustrates this principle with brutal clarity. The divorce decree included a provision that if the wife remarried within 3 years, she would have to convey a 1/3 interest in her real estate to each of her 2 children, effectively stripping her of the property she had been awarded as alimony. The court in that case explicitly upheld the validity of this restraint on remarriage, citing the well-recognized exception that restrictions on second marriages are held to a much lower standard of public policy than restrictions on first marriages, a legal doctrine that essentially treated divorced women as a separate class of citizens with fewer constitutional rights than never-married women when it came to the fundamental right to marry. The Saslow court's reasoning is worth quoting directly because it lays bare the paternalistic logic that animated this entire legal edifice. The court noted approvingly that a husband may be willing to leave control of his property to his divorced wife as the best means of keeping the children together and of providing for their support and education, and yet very reasonably may be unwilling to entrust her with the same power after she has remarried and a stranger has become the head of the household. There it is, in the plain language of a published judicial opinion. The divorced woman is not an adult citizen with full property rights. She is a temporary steward of her ex-husband's property and a stranger. Her new husband must not be allowed to become the head of a household that still, in the eyes of the law, belongs to the man she divorced. This legal framework turned children into spies and mothers into suspects in their own homes, because a divorced woman who fell in love again knew that accepting a marriage proposal could mean losing the roof over her head and the savings she had scraped together. And if her children were old enough to understand the financial implications, they might actively oppose her remarriage, not out of emotional loyalty to their father, but out of cold calculation about their own financial futures. The cruelty of this rule lay in the way it poisoned the mother-child relationship. The children were given a financial stake in their mother's loneliness, and the mother was forced to weigh her desire for adult love and companionship against the material security of the people she loved most in the world. We've arrived at the final chapter of this long, dark journey, and I want to close with a rule that might be the strangest of all because it reveals the ultimate purpose of every other rule we've discussed. In the 1950s, a divorced woman was not allowed to speak publicly about her experience, not in a memoir, not in a newspaper interview, not in a community forum, not even in a private conversation that might be overheard by the wrong person, because the culture had erected a wall of silence around divorce so high and so thick that the women who had survived the gauntlet we've been describing could rarely find each other, could rarely share their stories, could rarely confirm for one another that the nightmare was real and not some private failure of their own character. This enforced silence wasn't a law on the books, but a social code so powerful it functioned with the force of law. A divorced woman who spoke openly about the reasons for her divorce, the abuse, the abandonment, The simple grinding misery of two people who should never have married was seen not as a truth-teller or a survivor, but as a bitter, vindictive woman who was airing dirty laundry, embarrassing her ex-husband, traumatizing her children, and violating the code of feminine discretion that demanded women suffer in silence. The result was a profound isolation that distorted reality for millions of women. Each individual divorced woman believed she was the only one, that her particular circumstances were uniquely shameful, that the other divorced women she sometimes glimpsed in the grocery store or the back pew of a progressive church were probably more deserving of their fate than she was, because the silence prevented the formation of any collective consciousness, any shared understanding that the problem was not individual women failing at marriage, but a system designed to punish women for escaping marriage, This is why the oral histories and memoirs I've been quoting throughout this piece are so precious and so rare. Most of the women who lived through this never wrote anything down, never gave an interview, never told their grandchildren what they had endured, because the habit of silence had been beaten into them so thoroughly that even decades later, when the laws had changed and the stigma had softened, they couldn't bring themselves to break it. The silence was the master rule that made all the other rules possible. The staged adultery, the mourning wardrobe, the 6-month quarantine, the male cosigner requirement, the custody blackmail, the workplace firings, the neighborhood surveillance, the identity erasure, the lobotomy threat, the incarceration, the church excommunication, the burial denial, the home inspections, the friendship purge, the medical abandonment, the remarriage penalty, all of it operated in the dark, unexamined, unchallenged, because the women who knew the truth were not allowed to speak it. And so, when I tell you these stories now, I am not just recounting bizarre historical curiosities. I am breaking a silence that was imposed on millions of women by a society that demanded their invisibility as the price of their survival. The strange rules divorced women had to follow in the 1950s were not just a collection of quirky anachronisms. They were a coordinated system of social, legal, medical, religious, and economic control designed to send a single, unmistakable message. You are not free, you will never be free. And if you dare to act like you are free, we will find new ways to punish you that you haven't even imagined yet. The women who endured this, who raised their children in the shadow of it, who died without ever telling anyone what they had survived, deserve to have their stories told now, not as a distant historical footnote, but as a reminder of how recently these rules held sway, and how fragile our current freedoms really are when you consider how quickly a society can construct an entire architecture of oppression around something as simple as a woman choosing to leave a marriage that was breaking her. So here we are, at the end of this long, unflinching walk through the strange, cruel, and meticulously engineered rules that governed the lives of divorced women in the 1950s. And if you've stayed with me through all 18 sections, you've probably felt your stomach turn more than once, not just because the individual rules are shocking, but because of what they reveal when you step back and look at the whole architecture at once. This wasn't random cruelty. This wasn't a few bad apples, a few overly judgmental neighbors, a few outdated laws that hadn't caught up with the times. This was a system, a coherent and interlocking machine of social control in which every part reinforced every other part. A cage with bars made of courtroom procedures and church doctrine and banking regulations and medical ethics and neighborhood gossip and fashion magazines and insurance policies and criminal statutes, all of them aligned toward a single goal: to make sure that a woman who escaped her marriage would never escape the consequences of escaping. Think about how the pieces fit together. You couldn't get a divorce without proving fault. And proving fault required a public spectacle so humiliating it deterred all but the most desperate. If you survived that, you had to dress like a widow and behave like a nun for 6 months, because any visible sign of relief or joy was proof of your moral bankruptcy. If you survived that, you discovered you couldn't sign a lease, open a bank account, or get a credit card without a man's signature, so your financial independence was a lie. If you found a way around that, your employer could fire you for being a bad influence on the other secretaries. If you kept your job anyway, your neighbors were keeping a log of your visitors and sharing it with your landlord and your ex-husband's lawyer. If you tried to ignore them, your children could be taken away based on a neighbor's affidavit about a male silhouette in your window. If you fought back, you could be declared insane and lobotomized, or arrested as a wayward woman and sent to a reformatory. If you avoided all of that, Your church would bar you from communion, your friends would stop calling, your own children might sue you if you tried to remarry, and when you got sick, there was no doctor who would treat you without cash you didn't have. And if somehow you survived all of it, the poverty, the isolation, the surveillance, the humiliation, the legal persecution, the medical neglect, the spiritual abandonment, you were not allowed to tell anyone what had happened to you, because the final rule was silence. And the silence ensured that the next woman facing the same gauntlet would believe she was the only one, would blame herself, would internalize the shame, and would never know that her suffering was not a personal failure, but a political design. That's the thing I want you to sit with as we close. The rules we've explored are strange in their specifics. The staged adultery photos, the ice-pick lobotomies, the morality clauses, the wayward minor statutes. But the logic behind them is not strange at all. It's the logic of control. The same logic that has always operated when a dominant group feels threatened by the possibility of a subordinate group's freedom. The 1950s were a time of profound anxiety about gender roles, about the family, about what would happen if women could simply walk away from marriages they didn't want, and the society responded not by making marriages better or by supporting women's economic independence, but by making the cost of walking away so catastrophically high that only the truly desperate would attempt it, and even they would pay for it for the rest of their lives. The rules served a function. They were a warning, broadcast on every frequency the culture had available, that divorce was not an escape. It was a trade-only cage for another. One set of rules for an even more punishing set of rules, one form of subordination for a form of subordination that was lonelier, poorer, and more relentlessly surveilled. And yet, here's what gives me a stubborn, defiant hope despite everything we've uncovered. Women survived this. They found each other in the margins, in the cheap rooming houses and the secret networks of support, in the rare progressive churches and the anonymous big cities where they could reinvent themselves. They raised children who grew up to ask questions about what their mothers had endured. They wrote letters and diaries that historians would eventually find, preserving fragments of a story that the culture tried to erase. They whispered the truth to each other in the diners and the laundromats and the back pews, refusing to let the silence be total. And they kept going, because that's what human beings do, even when the system is designed to break them, even when the rules are stacked against them, even when every door is locked and every window is barred and every face they see is turned away in judgment. They kept going, and some of them lived long enough to see the no-fault divorce revolution of the 1970s, to see the laws change, to see the stigma soften, to see a world where a divorced woman could sign her own lease and keep her own name and tell her own story without being locked up or cut open or cast out. The strange rules divorced women had to follow in the 1950s are not just a historical oddity. They're a mirror. They show us how recently we emerged from a world where half the population could be subjected to this kind of systematic oppression, and they remind us that rights we take for granted, the right to leave a bad marriage, the right to control our own bodies, the right to earn a living and keep our earnings, the right to raise our children without state surveillance, the right to tell our own stories were not handed down from on high as gifts. They were fought for, slowly, painfully, by generations of women who refused to be silent, who refused to be broken, who refused to accept that their freedom was a crime and their survival was a scandal. The women who lived through these rules are mostly gone now, but their stories remain, and if you've read this far, you're now part of the long, slow work of breaking the silence that was the strangest and cruelest rule of all.